Before I begin, I ask you to remember the old adage. If you don't like the message, please don't take your anger out on the messenger. I'm going to describe, as best I can, the situation with the United States economic system, which has a name, capitalism. To give you a hint of where we're headed, this system is in very deep trouble. It's in the greatest difficulty I've ever seen in my lifetime, and you can tell from my white hair that I've been around a while. I never expected to witness what I'm experiencing now. I imagine for many of you it's the same, unless you're committed to what my psychotherapist wife calls denial. Not the river in Egypt, but an inability to confront what's happening because it's frightening. It's a very human thing to do, like a child who covers their face when a scary dog is nearby, thinking at age 3 that if you can't see it, it isn't there. If you don't see what's going on around us, perhaps it isn't there. Our political, cultural, and economic leaders, with very few exceptions, share a commitment to denial. So my presentation today aims to break through the mechanisms of denial surrounding us to tell you what I think is happening. I'm not infallible. I make mistakes like everyone else, but this is the fruit of a lifetime observing U.S. capitalism. Born in Youngstown, Ohio, I've lived and worked here all my life. I've never seen anything like the situation we're in now. To provide a framework, I believe the history of the world is a sequence of empires with interruptions: the Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, Chinese, and so on. They all share a pattern. They're born, often from the demise of another empire, evolve over decades or centuries, and then die. The most recent and well-studied example is the British Empire, which, depending on how you count, spanned from the 16th century to the end of the 19th, roughly 3 or 4 centuries. Out of its disintegration, punctuated by the American War of Independence centered around Boston, a part of that empire broke away. The British Empire denied this was building, even though it was evident throughout the 18th century. In 1776, that denial blew up in its face as the colonists in this relatively small, unimportant part of the empire demanded independence. A war was fought, and to the surprise and chagrin of the British Empire and King George III, the British lost. Lest we forget, they tried again in 1812 and lost again. This set in motion the disintegration of the British Empire, which ended after World War I. Out of this emerged the American Empire. American capitalism in the 19th century resolved key internal contradictions, most notably the coexistence of a capitalist Northeast and Midwest with a slave-holding South. This was resolved by the willful destruction of slavery by capitalists. The Civil War was the expropriation, without compensation, of the South's most important wealth, enslaved people. Emancipation impoverished the white slaveholders, showing a stark disregard for the sanctity of private property. Having destroyed its competitor with enormous violence, capitalism took off. Starting around 1870, U.S. capitalism experienced a century of economic growth. Statistics, crude as they are, show uninterrupted growth from the 1870s to the 1970s. Every decade, real wages for workers were higher than the decade before, even through the Great Depression. Profits grew even faster. This created a rare situation, a capitalism that delivered rising profits to capitalists and rising wages to most workers, except, crucially, those not born white. This exceptional growth led Americans to view the United States as exceptional. If you're religious, you might think God favored Americans. If not, you might attribute it to entrepreneurship or some vague quality. My professors loved that term, though it's unclear what it means. But it was exceptional, and Americans embraced the notion that this exceptionality was inherent and eternal. They believed the American economy, culture, political system, and military would dominate globally, pushing aside those who resisted. It became, I say carefully, delusional. When signs emerged that the American empire, after a century of ascent, was peaking and declining, its leaders, steeped in this history, denied it. They couldn't see what was exploding around them. Recently, Americans have again been confronted with the level of violence committed daily by police against citizens. Some blame individual officers, refusing to see this as a social phenomenon that's been worsening for a long time. This is the same denial. Let's begin with economics, as that's what I know best after a lifetime of study. Over the last 40 years, roughly 1980 to now, economists of all political persuasions using the same data agree. There has been a radical redistribution of wealth from the bottom and middle to the top. The top 10% have done well, the top 5% even better, the top 1% better still, and the top 0.1% best of all. You know them: Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, and others. Our culture ensures you know them. They've grown much richer over these 40 years, partly because we changed tax laws to favor corporations and the wealthy, shifting the burden onto the middle and bottom. This was done under both Republicans and Democrats, with slight differences in speed but not in substance. Even more significant is the relationship between capital and labor, corporations and employees. From 1870 to 1970, real wages rose, meaning workers' earnings, adjusted for prices, increased faster than inflation, allowing them to buy more goods and services. In the 1970s, this stopped and has never resumed. The average American worker today earns, in real terms, what they did in 1978. For a country accustomed to a century of rising wages, this is a traumatic shift. How was it handled? Denial. There was no serious discussion or debate about what to do. The closest we got was vague remarks about the fading middle class, as if it were caused by sunspots or allergies, not systemic issues. The consequences were profound. First, women left the home en masse to work for wages, a role previously forced on Black, brown, and the poorest white women. This was necessary to sustain the fantasy of the American dream. Second, Americans turned to borrowing to maintain consumption growth. In the 1970s, banks began lending to consumers via credit cards, previously reserved for the wealthy. The American working class accumulated unprecedented debt, becoming pioneers not in covered wagons, but in plastic-filled wallets. All consumption growth over the last 40 years has relied on women's earnings and debt. Families became more complex and strained, leading to the world's highest divorce rates and American women consuming more psychotropic drugs than any other population. The mother, often the emotional anchor of the family, was now as exhausted as her husband. The empire's foundation began to crack. This debt-fueled system, mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and now student loans, couldn't last. The 2008 financial crisis exposed its fragility. If wages don't rise, accumulating debt becomes unsustainable. Inequality worsened as workers' productivity soared with computers, robots, and AI, but their wages remained flat. Employers, a tiny fraction of the population, reaped the benefits. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, inequality grew. The working class faced flat wages, COVID, inflation, and now rising interest rates. Historically, Germany offers a parallel. In the late 19th century, Germany competed with the US to replace the declining British Empire. World War I defeated Germany, stripping its empire and imposing crushing reparations. By 1923, hyperinflation wiped out savings, followed by the Great Depression in 1929. Overwhelmed, the German working class, despite being highly educated and productive, turned to Adolf Hitler in 1932. The U.S. risks a similar trajectory: denial, economic blows, and social unrest. For half a century, the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency has been a huge advantage, functioning like gold. That's ending. Countries like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela are shifting to China's currency. China shows signs of a rising empire, matching the U.S.'s decline. Economically, the U.S. has a GDP of $21 trillion, Russia $1.5 trillion, and China $17.5 trillion. China's growth rate of 6 to 9% annually far outpaces the U.S.'s 2 to 3%. China has overtaken the U.S. in many fields, like TikTok's dominance in social media. The U.S. response? Trade wars, tariffs, sanctions has failed. The Ukraine conflict, a proxy war to weaken Russia, China's ally, has not gone as planned. Russia's economy has held up, finding new markets in China and India. The US and its allies, with a combined GDP of $30 to $35 trillion, face a Russia with $1.5 trillion, yet the narrative of victory is faltering. Divisions in the US deepen daily, rooted in worsening inequality. Corporations evade taxes, and inflation outpaces wages, eroding the working class. Scapegoating immigrants or others distracts from systemic issues. Young Americans facing dim job prospects increasingly reject capitalism. A recent Gallup poll shows a majority of those 35 and younger prefers socialism, not because they understand it, but because they're angry at capitalism's failures. Since World War II, the US has repeatedly invaded smaller nations, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and lost. In Ukraine, Russia is advancing. Denial prevents honest confrontation with these realities. The British Empire, after failing to subdue the US militarily, adapted and built a relationship. The US must learn to coexist with China, a rising power with 4 times our population, allied with India. War is not an option, it's a path to mutual destruction. The corporations and the rich profiting from the system won't change it. The working class, soldiers, and taxpayers bears the burden. Denial has prevailed over honest confrontation. Marx once said capitalism would destroy itself. The question is whether we'll let it take us down with it. Even symbols like the pickup truck reflect this system's manipulation. Its high profit margins protected by a 25% tariff contrast with sedans' 2.5%. This isn't about masculinity, it's about profit, driven by policy, not choice.